We went to ask our fellow Chinese people in the community what their thoughts were and what their stories were about interracial relationships.
Yeah, often threats of disownment, kicking out of the house. Literally, it's as if you were never born.
And he loves pork.
Missed out on all that good char siu, man.
Missed out on all that. Yeah, exactly. And they never served him pork. We're talking about interracial relationships, Kev. Oh, that's a touchy subject, isn't it?
It is a touchy subject, yeah. I almost went back and forth on doing this one because I had some reservations about how it would be received. You were like, no, let's push on. It's a subject that matters to a lot of people, and it's a subject that people find themselves in as well in their current life. So I was a bit hesitant. I was playing it safe, and I'm normally not the one to play it safe. But you were like, no, let's go. It's
an important subject. I think it's an important subject because it's been a bit of a taboo subject for Chinese people to have an interracial relationship with someone who is not Chinese, maybe English, maybe Indian, maybe other cultures. It's starting to become less taboo. And I think it's important for us, Kev, as parents, bringing up our children in a Western culture, that there is a very high possibility that our children might bring home a partner from a non-Chinese background. Right?
I agree.
So it's important.
Yeah.
But we did something slightly different this episode, and that is you won't just be hearing us rant on about what's going on in our heads, but we went out to the public and we asked the nation what they thought about interracial relationships. We went to ask our fellow Chinese people in the community what their thoughts were and what their stories were about interracial relationships. And we got a lot of feedback.
Oh, yeah. We weren't expecting the amount of feedback that we got. There was a lot positive, negative, somewhere in between, some extremes, and some nice stories, actually. I think maybe we start...
Yes.
Should we start with a nice one?
Let's start off with the nice one, but let's set the tone to start with.
Sure.
But Kev, tell me your experience of interracial relationships.
So without going into detail, my mum was never offended by the concept, but she never encouraged the concept either. And my dad's very open-minded. He was like, yeah, do what you wish, son. He was very open to me having different partners from different cultures. I do feel they had a slight preference towards me finding an Asian partner. Other than that, it wasn't really actively discouraged as I was growing up.
Was it encouraged?
No, it definitely wasn't encouraged. Yeah.
Yeah, I think similar in that I was definitely encouraged, and there was a skew towards it would be nice if you married a Chinese girl. It was never very forceful. It was encouragement to go a certain direction. That's the background. Many people have similar backgrounds on interracial relationships. We went out to the public and asked. Let's start with some of the nice stories.
So this is a story from a person, I won't say which because it might reveal the identity, but it's someone that we know. And they have always had non-Chinese, Asian, or Western girlfriends. Their parents were quite happy for him to have non-Chinese girlfriends. They would have also preferred if he had a Chinese or Vietnamese girlfriend. I think that was their overall preference, but they didn't mind as long as he was happy, which is actually a really good story and a really nice story to start off with. On the other side, the parents of and the family of his English girlfriends were equally as accepting to so he had never had any poor experience of interracial relationships. And actually he married an English girl and has had 2 beautiful boys out of the relationship as well. So
lovely.
A very nice story to start.
Okay, that's a nice story.
Yeah.
But I feel that those types of positive stories are in the minority.
Yeah.
Based on the response we've had and experience of the people around us growing up, it's a relatively rare situation where you get such a nice, positive acceptance of multicultural relationships, right?
I think it's probably quite important to note that we are talking from a perspective of being 40-year-olds and our parents are in their 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
That's really important because we're not talking about the 20-year-olds of now who have
Oh no.
their 40s and 50s, because they might have an entirely different outlook to our own experience growing up. So I would expect, for instance, this is my own assumption, that someone that's 20 now and their mum and dad are in their late 40s would be
Yeah.
much more open to the idea of an interracial relationship. We're talking from a perspective of growing up in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, I think anywhere between the 70s all the way to the noughties, 70 to 2000,
Yeah.
was the generation that kind of, and towards the 2000 it got a little bit more accepted. But I think you're right. 70s, 80s, 90s were generally skewed. So we've had loads of stories. I'm going to fire another one off. I've heard that kind of story where the parent is so against an interracial relationship that they've thrown them out, essentially. They've thrown the children out, which is really extreme.
And I think it was fairly common back then.
Yeah.
Often threats of disownment, kicking out of the house.
Yeah.
Literally, it's as if you were never born.
Yeah.
I've heard of stories where that's actually happened, where someone's been kicked out of a house and they've just been estranged for many years. We're talking 10 years, and then they have reconnected back into the family, but it took a long time for that to happen. I think that's fairly common of parents from the 80s and 90s when their child, who is of Chinese or Asian descent, goes and finds a foreign partner. Why do you think that is?
Well, I was, yeah, I mean, I was going to say that there's many reasons for this. I think there is, firstly, I think there's this maybe biased view that a lot of old traditional Chinese people think that Western cultures are a little bit more laxed on the whole marriage and commitment thing, and that, the whole divorce thing is quite common within Western cultures. And I think there's that kind of trust element that I don't want my son or daughter marrying into a Western culture at the fear of, one day it doesn't work out, and then the other side just walks off and leaves their son or daughter. I think there's that. And then I think there's the whole money thing, where I feel that they kind of I don't think that's the case anymore, but I think there was a case back in the day when they used to think that we don't want Western cultures to come and take all our money. They don't want them to come and take my money. I don't want my son or daughter to marry a Western individual because of fear that they might take their money. Which actually leads me on to another story
Mm-hmm.
where one of our commenters said that at first their father wasn't accepting of their English partner, thinking it was about money, but actually the English partner's family were quite wealthy and lived in a really sort of nice, wealthy part of the UK with a high flying career. Got married, end up sending both kids to private school. Still together 30 years on, and kind of proved the dad wrong. But there was still that bias. So it wasn't just about money. There was also the traditional bias there.
Yeah, there's a few things to break down there. Their hard-earned cash that they worked 13 hours a day for in a takeaway or a restaurant, and their pot of money that they'd built up to try and elevate their family. Immigrants that came over from Hong Kong to the UK came from the new territories, right? They weren't from the educated side of Hong Kong Island, etc. And they managed to finally make their family have a little bit to be proud of and have a bit of a financial nest egg for them to grow into.
Mm.
So the idea that this concept that the bad Westerner was going to come along and, take their daughter or son away and then suddenly grapple away their financial nest egg was certainly something that was very real back then. It's funny how you mentioned the story about the couple where the Western partner was actually the one with the money, because you don't often hear about that from the parents, because they would focus on the negative relationships
Yeah,
that they've
absolutely.
seen. They would have seen, oh, so and so got married to this person and they only lasted 2 years and half the money went to him when they got divorced, and now she's manically depressed, etc. You'd hear those stories and you wouldn't hear about the ones that were successful, like the one you've just mentioned there.
Yeah, exactly. I do feel that bias is waning away, becoming less and less apparent. I don't
Mm.
know why that is. Why do you think that is? You mentioned at the beginning, for someone who's a 20-year-old watching this, they probably won't relate to a lot of the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s sort
Mm.
of treatment of marrying into other cultures as we did.
I think it's definitely because there's a lot more relationships of interracial examples that are proving to be successful. And when I say successful, I mean they're married, they've had kids. That those some of those kids are in their own 20s and 30s now, who are well-adjusted individuals and haven't come from broken homes. So I think now we are 30, 40, 50 years from that point where parents were fearful of what those relationships might turn into. And we've now got living examples of what those relationships are like. A lot of them are successful relationships with functioning families. So this myth has been broken that interracial relationships between Western culture and Asian cultures can't work. It absolutely works.
Yeah, I think so. Talks about Chinese and Western, but actually we've had quite a lot of commenters about marrying Indian, of Indian descent. We were about 4 or 5 people who commented. Somebody who commented on our post said that they've got a YouTube channel about their life as an interracial Chinese Indian couple. Maybe we'll share that. We should share that.
Yeah, I think so. We can probably tag them in the post a little.
We'll tag them in the post. One funny story of a Chinese Indian couple was that the wasn't about acceptance. It was actually the complete opposite, and that was the fear of offending the partner. They were so keen on making their partner feel accepted that they went above and beyond trying to make him feel accepted. And one of the ways they made him feel accepted, and a little bit of, I guess, a bit of ignorance and culture here, was that they thought that all brown people didn't eat pork.
Okay.
And so they never, ever served him pork. And he loves pork.
Missed out on all that good char siu, man.
Missed out on all that. Yeah, exactly. And they never served him pork. And funnily enough, the wife never corrected them,
Wow.
which is funny. But that's the
Has he
complete
now had a
opposite.
taste of char siu, and does he now
Probably can't get enough of it, right? That's the case of the complete opposite, where not only did they accept him, they went so far to make him feel part of the family.
Yeah, and those are
Great
nice to
story.
hear, aren't they?
Those are nice stories.
Fairly rare to hear, but it's nice when the family makes an effort to make the partner feel accommodated for. I think language is a significant thing here, because I think initially it's culture and language, isn't it? The fear of why having a non-Asian partner might not be their preference is purely because of the communication barrier and a language barrier, where they think, okay, well, if they have children, then they may not be able to communicate with their grandchildren. But actually, it's the same with us, isn't it? Really, kids
Exactly.
don't. I would love them to do more, but because we speak English in the household as well, predominantly English, we watch a lot of Chinese films and we listen to a lot of Chinese music, etc. But we don't practice it enough for them
No.
to soak it up. You know.
That's exactly it. It is a real tragedy, in my view, that our
Mm.
our kids aren't as exposed. There's no one else's fault apart from ours, as in mine and Jan's, that we haven't exposed them and forced them down a route to speak Cantonese. And it's a real tragedy. We have that exact same problem in bringing them up in this Western culture, that they no longer speak Cantonese very well, and their communication with their grandparents aren't even near as effective as it should be.
Yeah.
And therefore, there's a bit of a barrier, bit of a distance. Is that same with you?
Yeah, I think so. And it's this that initial fear for getting into an interracial relationship. It's the same outcome, isn't it? Whether their kid is 100% Chinese or whether they're of products of an interracial relationship, it doesn't make a difference, because English is the predominant language they'll use, regardless if they're full Chinese or a product of an interracial relationship. They would want to speak more Cantonese or Chinese to connect with the culture more, but because they're not exposed to it enough, they don't get that connectivity towards that side of their culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also people forget that there was that bias of marrying someone in another culture, Western culture, for example, because they might be a dickhead and just
Yeah.
go, right. But really, when
Yeah.
you think about it, you could be Chinese and still be a dickhead.
Oh, I think there is.
There's probably more dickheads nowadays than ever.
Yeah, that's absolutely.
It doesn't matter what race you are, what culture you're from. The likelihood is, if you're a dickhead, you're a dickhead.
I prescribe to that 100%. Regardless of race, colour, there are good and bad people in every single race. And you can't one group of people because of your experience with one person from that race. It's
Exactly.
ridiculous. And that's my solid belief. And I think it's most people with half a brain cell's belief, to be honest.
I think not only does that ring true nowadays, and I don't know why it's more exposed now, but maybe because of the internet and social and things like that, it's made it more apparent that you actually get dickheads on both sides of the pond. That, you know, sometimes you think you are doing the right thing by marrying someone who's from Hong Kong or Chinese or whatever, but actually, if you don't click, you just don't click.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why you often see these relationships where you think, how does that work? And neither person in the relationship can speak the other one's language, but they
Yeah,
somehow have this deep connection, stay
and that's
together forever. You know,
and that's beautiful.
it's amazing, isn't it? They
Yeah,
can't. They make a conscious effort to learn each other's language, but it's not even like they have a common language in English. They just can't speak each other's language, but they have found this love blossom out of nowhere. I think that's amazing, isn't it? Really? Yeah.
the language of love, Kev.
Yeah.
How would you feel about your kids marrying non-Chinese in
Oh,
a different
it's not.
culture?
It's not even an issue. There's good and bad people in every culture and race. As long as they're a decent person, they love my son, and my son loves them, and they both treat each other with respect and care. I'm not naive to think that that's enough to carry you through all your life, but I do think they're the foundations of staying together for a long time, and that doesn't matter if they're from any culture. It doesn't bother me at all. What about yourself?
I subscribe to the belief that you marry someone because they're good to you
Yeah.
and they make you happy, you make them happy. And I think that's all you should care about. We've heard horrifying stories of, you know, people getting chucked out because they've married or in a relationship with another culture, or there was one story where the father, older age, got so mad they actually chased the couple out with a cleaver,
Why?
with a
Right.
meat cleaver. Probably more in the 80s. You probably
Yeah.
can't get away with that sort of shit nowadays.
But why was it, right, the weapon of choice for Asian males in the 80s and 90s was the meat cleaver? That
Yeah,
was
I'll
the
be honest with you.
ultimate.
It's the perfect weapon. It does the business from a frightening point of view.
Yeah?
You are not going to mess with anyone with a meat cleaver.
No, no,
From a practical perspective, it does its job in scaring the person on the
this
receiving
is
end.
true. Yeah.
Back in the day, that's the only knife that they probably had
In the kitchen, right?
in the
At the
kitchen, because that
bakery.
meat cleaver did everything. It cut vegetables, meat, it did everything. Nowadays, we've got like a whole. My wife's like going, "Excuse me, that's not for that's not that's for the bread." They didn't have a bread knife. They cut
No,
the
no,
bread with a
the
meat
meat
cleaver.
cleaver. Meat cleaver was for bread, meat, vegetables. You know, it was the most universal utensil you could have in the house, right? For
Yeah,
sure.
the meat cleaver really was universal.
Yeah. We've heard multiple stories about where fathers have chased partners away with meat cleavers. It's not just once, it's multiple times that we've seen that happen. It's always the typical scene, isn't it? The lad running away down the street and the Asian father running after them with the meat cleaver in his hand,
With meat,
you know, waving it in the
yeah,
air.
with a chef's hat and an apron on.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
but why does that not happen nowadays? Why is the meat cleaver being sort of cast away? Is it not cool to have the meat cleaver anymore?
We don't have the meat cleaver anymore.
We have better knives nowadays.
We're tired.
We have a more range of knives. Chasing down the street with a bread knife.
It's a keyboard and mouse because that's what we're working
Keyboard
at.
warriors. Oh, I think the shift in attitude between the 70s, 80s, and 90s and now is stark. Back in the day, it was a very practical era. There wasn't a lot of empathy between father and son or daughter and mother. It was all on a very practical basis. If you married a Westerner or someone outsider, it will be bad. You will lose all our money, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And it was a very practical basis. There was never empathy. The emphasis was, I'm doing this for your own good, rather than I'm doing this for your own happiness. The
That,
happiness
yeah.
piece was never
Oh,
a thing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It was
no.
always, I want you to do this. I want you to marry this person because it's for your own good.
Yeah.
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 But
Yeah.
nowadays, we don't do that anymore. We don't want bad happening to our kids. But at the same time, we emphasize more on our kids happy.
I think you're right. It was almost before the generation above us was we know best for you. You don't know what's best for you. We know the best for you. So we can
Yeah.
we choose your career to a point. We will steer what you study. We'll steer what you go into as a career. We'll steer who you marry and we'll steer where you live. It's that type of attitude. We know the best decisions for you and where you should end up. Whereas now, you're right, we want you to be happy regardless of your choices. We want you to make good choices, but they're your own choices. As long as you're happy, we'll live with them. And I don't think that's just an Asian thing. I think it's a generational thing. Parents now are giving way more to their kids and giving them way more liberal decision making because they want them to be happy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the happiness piece is more important now than it used to be. And I think even now, sometimes the way I love her to bits, my mum, but quite often, even the conversations we have now between me, a 43-year-old man, and an 80-year-old woman, even now, the habit doesn't break. It's kind of, oh, you've got a cough, you must eat this, and you
Yeah.
must bowl it hong, and you must make this soup, and you
Mm.
must do this. And quite often, even as a 43-year-old man, I don't say it, but in my mind, I'm thinking, I think I know how to look after myself now, that
Yeah.
type of thing. But it's kind of, and quite often as well, I realize, and I don't say anything, I just accept it because she's 80. But I also think that parents who were sort of our age in the 70s, 80s, and 90s didn't have a lot of self checking. They didn't check how they were coming across or being perceived.
Oh, yeah.
They want good for you is enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Their decision making overruled yours. They didn't really care how you felt. They didn't
Yep.
self check in and they didn't check in with their kids either. Are you happy with this decision? Is this what you want to happen? I was watching a video on Instagram about an American born Chinese girl, and she was asking her mum, who was now around in her 70s and 80s, do you regret anything about bringing us up? And it was of a very similar vein. She was like, we were so focused on working, we didn't know what we were doing as parents. And you will behave this way, and you will study this at school, and you will go to this uni, and you will have this career. It was quite military. She said, on reflection, she should have spent more time with them to understand who her children were and be able to communicate with them on a level to understand and be connected to the children. She said that she just wasn't connected to her kids whatsoever until they got
But it was,
older.
yeah. But was it too late then?
No, I think they've got a good relationship now.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and that's a happier ending, but quite more often than none is the fact that that same story where, oh, I was in survival mode, I was just trying to make sure the family was alive, you know,
Yeah.
and it ends with that the mum or dad is now in their 80s or 70s, 80s or 90s and wish they had a closer relationship with their
Yeah.
now son who now is in their 30s, 40s, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And they've moved away to another city for work and they
Yeah,
hardly ever
and
phone them.
that
Yeah.
is sad, and that's the sad thing,
Yeah.
because whilst we're not bashing the 70s, 80s, 90s, without the 70s, 80s, 90s, we all wouldn't be here.
Mm.
But I think there's a point here amongst all the stories, the positive and the negative ones, where people were, chased out of the house, sometimes with a cleaver. That at the end of the day, that whatever happened back then, whatever negative things happened, we all wouldn't be here without that happening.
Yeah, I think so. They're all our own individual experiences that brought us here. Some of them end well, where the love and the connection between child and parents is strong enough to carry them through that period. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes they become estranged and lose connection with their parents and don't speak for months, weeks, years on end. And
Which
that's
is
sad.
sad.
Yeah.
So I think there's a message here, Kev, for everybody, is that no matter what race, what culture, what your background is, we just be good to each other and let's all be happy.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you'll find good and bad in every race and culture. I think we should say a massive thank you for all the respondents as well, because we got
Yeah.
such a response from people around, and without them, this episode wouldn't have been possible. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Much
everyone.
appreciated.
If you have a topic that you feel really strongly about, that you want us to cover and talk about, feel free to drop us an Instagram DM message and we'll pick it up. That's all for this week. Thanks, Kev.
Thanks, Tez.
We went out to the public and we asked the nation about what they thought about interracial relationships. And we got a
relationships.
Interracial.
Let's
start that again.
Yeah. Interracial.
Interfacial. Interfacial relationships we're talking about today, ladies and gentlemen.
Interfacial.
That's another episode, Kev. That.
Yeah. Interracial fellatio. That's what we're talking about.
We'll stick that at the end. We'll stick that at the end.
We're not offended anyone. It's
we're not offended. No, who's offended by interfacial? Is anybody gonna be? Is anybody actually gonna be offended by interfacial?
It just sounds very dirty. Interfacial. Yeah.
Well, maybe we do an episode on interfacial. I don't know. Maybe that's a thing. Maybe that's a thing that's going out. It may be taboo now, but maybe not for our kids. You know.
Sure.
But from my perspective, the interracial relationship was never encouraged.
Interracial again.
Interrelational. You talk.
Yeah. So right.
Right.